been a few years since you showed recent work in New York. Not surprisingly, there have been some changes in the work, and the way you've described them to me, how they evolved. For instance, the signatures that in some paintings you have initials, the JL, or your name written out, and you talked about how that first started, I think, in a painting where there was a blank shape that looked like an L, and you thought,
right,
this could be the L of Lasker. And similarly with the cross forms that are in some of the recent paintings, where you also talked about how that kind of emerged in the process of working with elements in the paintings. And it's almost like there is the unconscious, somehow the unconscious of the painting is leading you to elements that, even though there's something so conscious and considered and planned about the paintings, there also seems to be an element, maybe increasingly so, of something that's not conscious.
Right. Well, there's a give and take in them. I mean, the execution seems very conscious and very constructed, yet at the same time, the origination of the works are, well, it's an imaginative process. I mean, I'm a painter, and it's an imaginative art form, and they happen imaginatively. So things lead into other things, and sometimes along the way, in the middle of a painting, something else can enter in. Even though I'll have quite often a study, which will be sort of sometimes a relatively complete miniature of what the larger painting will be, or maquette, as it were. Yet nonetheless, changes and alterations do happen. More additions than subtractions. It's very hard to subtract things from these paintings.
One of the things that I think is striking about your paintings is how there are different speeds within each painting. There are different speeds of looking, and there are different speeds, as you're describing the making of the painting, the different speeds of making the painting look. For instance, the speed, or rather the slowness with which the impasto gestures are made. Isn't that a very time-consuming?
They're actually very slow, right, it's true, because there's a lot of wet on wet going on in there. So in a way, it has some appearance of speed, but it actually is very meticulous. Oddly enough, it seems like a very simple form, but when I do those forms, they can take me that particular one, because it's relatively small, took me 3 days of 14-hour days in a row. When I do those, I'm just socked away in the studio. So they are very meticulous in a way.
And you leave signs of that process if someone looks carefully at the painting and looks at how you've made the gestures. You can see the history of the paintings, even though some of the paintings might seem at first glance very processed and very sort of cleanly executed, but they're actually, you do leave these, I mean, that's important for you, I think, to leave evidence of your process.
I do, yes. I mean, you can see it in the red, yellow, and blue form. You can get traces of the colors that are being intersected. And of course, the process is very clear as to chronologically which mark comes before which other mark.
One of the things that really marked a gap between the relationship to abstract expressionism and how you process, how you create your work, and that, introducing that distance. And I think someplace you talk about how you wanted to introduce this sort of strangeness or difficulty or distancing effect in the process of your making the work. And so the work that also what we're seeing are somehow translations.
Yeah, well, that is true. But I think the thing about these paintings, if you talk about the relationship to abstract expressionism, or maybe most specifically, we're talking about the relationship to so-called action painting. The direct impromptu mark, which is kind of very subjective, and in abstract expressionist rhetoric is regarded as being somewhat transcendent. I have no disrespect for that whole genre of work. As a matter of fact, I have the highest respect for it. But what seemed interesting to me in my work was to somehow or other take the subjective and objectify the subjective. So it's a little bit alienating in a way, but it really deals with the alienation I think it's a very contemporary condition. We're all a little bit removed from the immediacy in our lives. We're all very removed in space and time in a certain way. And I think it speaks about the contemporary condition.
This idea of is it about original and copy, or is it about some sort of maybe like identity and self, like forms that seem to mirror each other?
You'll have the same morphology in maybe 2 or 3 forms in the same painting, and the initial morphology will be relatively sketchy, and then the last morphology will be relatively concrete and very fleshed out with thick impasto paint. That happens as well. Yeah, so it is a little bit of an identity issue. It is a little bit of how we come to terms with how things come to being, or how we identify those things that are, that we see.
I think you said many years ago that what you wanted to do was try to restore faith in meaning in painting. Mm-hmm. You said something like, it's no longer the role of the artist to be a radical, but it's what we really need to do is restore faith in the possibility of meaning. So
right, the possibility. These paintings tend to interrogate meaning, but my hope is always, I'm sort of an essentialist in a way. My hope is always to establish some firm ground. I know it remains elusive, but it's actually an interest and an intent of mine. I'm not purely a deconstructionist. I'm actually interested in constructing, but it is of course elusive, but it is my process, and it is what I pursue in my paintings. But what I'm interested in, I guess, is to have the viewer see him or herself viewing, to see how they construct the picture in the mind, because the mind is always where the picture actually forms. What you have in front of you is random markings on a flat 2-dimensional surface, and the mind then takes those markings and then constructs a picture. And it could be a very finished landscape, and then one thinks one's looking at a landscape, but one, of course, is just looking at marks on canvas, really.
Well, this has been something that you've been concerned with, I think, from the beginning, where you say that you want you want your paintings to be discursive and not monotopical. That discursiveness, discursivity is that process you just described of the viewer putting things together, taking things apart, figuring it out for themselves, but being given something that that's not formalist. I think that's also I think your work is anti-formalist, even though you draw so richly and interestingly on the legacy of abstract painting of the 20th century. But I do think that at heart, the work is not at all in the line of formalist painting for precisely those reasons.
Well, yeah, these paintings actually, well, the very first paintings that started this whole body of work were really done in 1977 when I was just finishing my studies at Cal Arts. And that Cal Arts at that time was a very adamantly conceptual academy. And one was painting in the aftermath of, like, say, minimalism, where you felt that the picture plane had been cleared out. And so these paintings were done as a kind of a critique of minimalism, and a way of, like, proposing how you could use some of the terms and conditions of minimalism, namely, you're looking at what you're looking at, namely it is what it is, and also at the same time engaging the reality that the human imagination will always engage anything it's looking at, imaginatively. And because of that, the picture is, I mean, the painting is what it is, but the picture is that which it is not, and that which is in the mind of the viewer.